Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the bee's knees by the big cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 7, Day 7. But first, let's do our daily punishment. The baseball player was such a bad sport. He stole third base and then he just went home. Ha 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 ha. Oh, sports. Key terms for today: the Viet Minh, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Viet Cong, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Operation Rolling Thunder, the Fulbright Hearings, the Tet Offensive, George Wallace, and the election of 1968. We're going to talk about Vietnam before 1964, LBJ's Vietnam policy and his escalation in Southeast Asia, and the election of 1968 and its effects. Last class was really domestic policies of LBJ. Today is more of his foreign policy, mostly Vietnam. Now, we talked about Vietnam before, but I'm just going to give you some context just to give you like an overview of what's been going on in Vietnam. France colonized Vietnam in 1887. This was in the whole time period when European countries were eating up and taking over areas in Asia and Africa. The Viet Minh was an independence-based organization. It was formed in 1935 to 1936 to oppose colonization and push for Vietnamese independence. It was led by Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist and a nationalist. France will have their colonies conquered during World War II by Japan. So France is going to lose control of Vietnam to Japan during World War II. The Viet Minh are going to fight against the Japanese. France will regain control of Vietnam in 1945 after World War II. A lot of Vietnamese people wanted independence because that was one of the whole ideas of World War II. It was a focus on independence and self-government, but they are not going to give the Vietnamese people independence at first. France retakes over. Here's a picture of American Special Service people helping out the Viet Minh as they're fighting against the Japanese. A lot of these people supported Ho Chi Minh at first. When they actually first found Ho Chi Minh, he was dying and he was sick, and some American doctors helped him out. Let's talk about some more stuff about Vietnam. A lot of this is in context of the Cold War. President Truman is going to approve $23 million to aid France because the Viet Minh start fighting against the France because they're pushing for independence. Truman saw the Vietnamese as communist stooges, so he thought that he had to fight and support the French as part of the greater Cold War. It's the whole idea of the domino theory, that if you let one country become communist, like in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, then all of Southeast Asia will become communist, then Japan will become communist, and soon we'll all be speaking Russian or Chinese. In 1954, France is going to lose the Battle of Dien Bien Phu to the Viet Minh. They have to surrender their whole army. After this, France is going to pull out of Vietnam. In the Geneva Conference, Vietnam is going to be divided into two countries. North Vietnam is going to be communist, and South Vietnam is going to be non-communist. In 1955, President Eisenhower will send advisors into South Vietnam. In 1959, America has their first casualties in Vietnam. In 1960, North Vietnam is going to establish the Viet Cong to fight in South Vietnam. They want all of Vietnam to be united, and they want it to become communist. In the Geneva Conference, they did promise elections. Neither side really followed through with that. The South Vietnam government was corrupt. They did have elections, but it was like 99% of the people voted for them. So in 1960, the North Vietnamese people are going to create the Viet Cong. They're going to start sending people to South Vietnam to do a guerrilla warfare against the South Vietnamese government and the U.S. advisors that are helping. President Kennedy will increase troop deployment in 1961. He'll also approve the coup d'etat of the South Vietnamese leader, President Ngo Diem in 1963. He thought the new leader of South Vietnam would be more popular, which was not true. Here's the French surrender at Dien Bien Phu. Here's the division of Vietnam at first. Communist, non-communist. Let's talk about the escalation of Vietnam. In 1964 August, there was the Tonkin Gulf incident. America and Lyndon Johnson claimed that some of our Ships were sunk on the Gulf of Tonkin. They claimed that North Vietnam attacked our ships. Congress is going to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is going to basically give the president a blank check to do what he wants to defend American forces. So he basically has permission to do whatever he wants in Vietnam. And he's going to wait till after the election. And he's going to start sending more and more soldiers into Vietnam. In 1965, Johnson's going to start to escalate the war. He's going to start bombing and putting more troops in Vietnam. The first real offensive that America does is Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder was a huge bombing campaign that was in Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder was a bombing campaign for like 5 or 6 months, and it was they aimed for like oil areas in North Vietnam, also some troop areas, also some places in South Vietnam that were controlled by the communists. It was a failure. It's not going to work. It's not going to. The goal of Operation Rolling Thunder was to break the North Vietnamese will and to get them to negotiate. That's not going to happen. The Joint Chief of Staff is going to tell LBJ that he's going to need to send soldiers into Vietnam. Before this, he did not really want to do this. He was afraid that sending soldiers in would create a ground war, which it does do. But by the end of 1965, 184,000 soldiers were involved in Vietnam, and you're going to start to see American casualties mount. Here's a picture from Operation Rolling Thunder, the bombing campaign. There's going to be a lot of domestic discontent about the Vietnam War. You're going to start to see more anti-Vietnam War protests, which we'll talk about next class as well. This is going to start mounting on college campuses. Some draft resistors are going to flee to Canada. They'll burn their draft cards. They'll burn American flags. The draft was implemented in Vietnam, although it was not fair. If you were in college, you can get a deferment and not have to fight. Predominantly poor people, people of color, were the ones that were asked to fight in the Vietnam War. Rich man's war, poor man's fight. There's going to be major Vietnam protests in San Francisco, New York, and on major college campuses, which we'll talk more about later. This is one of the big protests in Vietnam and Washington, D.C. America is stuck in Vietnam. It's a quagmire. By the late 1960s, opposition was hard. There's a lot of doves. Doves are people that opposed the Vietnam War. Hawks were the ones that supported it. By 1968, it was the longest and most unpopular war in American history. In 1966, they're going to start the Fulbright Hearings. This was a series of hearings by the United States Senate and Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by the senator from Arkansas, Fulbright. This is going to be conducted on the Vietnam War from 66 to 71. It's going to show the lies of the Vietnam War. How LBJ kept saying we were winning the war, that the light was at the end of the tunnel, that everything was good. But this is kind of showing that this was not true. Johnson is going to be full of hubris. He's going to order the CIA to spy on American anti-war activists. The FBI will turn against peace groups. MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., is going to go against the Vietnam War. Johnson felt betrayed after what he did for the civil rights movement. They spy on him. That was actually started under the Kennedy administration. Johnson will stubbornly continue to assert that victory is just around the corner. But if you listen to Johnson and his tapes, he really knew that Vietnam, he felt like he was stuck in Vietnam. There was nothing he could do. If he pulled out of Vietnam, he would be seen as weak, and it would become communist, and he would be hit by the Kennedys. He hated the Kennedys as somebody that gave up the whole domino theory that now communism will spread. So he didn't really know what he could do. He felt like it was an unwinnable war, but like he couldn't just leave there. And it really is going to start to impact him negatively. America didn't have enough money to do his Great Society, which was his first real love, and the Vietnam War. So the Great Society is going to start to lose steam. Here's a famous picture of him right here. The turning point of the Vietnam War was in January 1968, the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a series of offensive in Vietnam. The Viet Cong are going to target 100 cities and town targets. This was then done on the Vietnamese holiday. They thought it would be a surprise, which it was. The Viet Cong planned this on the Vietnamese holiday. They went after 100 cities and towns. This was a military defeat, all the cities and towns were eventually reconquered by America and the South Vietnamese, but it was a political victory. This showed everybody that what Johnson was saying was a lie, which he was lying, that we were about to win the Vietnam War. This is going to impact public perception. You're going to have more protests. The military is going to demand 200,000 more soldiers, and this is at a time when people wanted to get out of Vietnam. It was the Tet Offensive was a series of surprise attacks. Yep, and it's going to lead to more and more people turning against the war, like Walter Cronkite, who's a famous news reporter. Here's a picture from the Tet Offensive. These are targets on the Tet Offensive. And the Vietnam War will topple Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Johnson could have ran for another term in 1968, but he was super unpopular by 68 because of the Vietnam War. He's going to be challenged by his own party, by a dove, Eugene McCarthy, and Robert Kennedy. Kennedy supported the Vietnam War, but once it became unpopular, he's going to oppose it, just like his brother was the one that really got us involved in Vietnam, him and Eisenhower and Truman. Like, there was a lot of presidents. But Robert Kennedy, very smart, very right when he needed to, right when the Vietnam War became unpopular, he suddenly changed his mind. So usually, sitting presidents aren't challenged by their own party, but Johnson will be. In New Hampshire, McCarthy actually beats Johnson, and Johnson realizes he's not going to be able to even win, so he decides he says he will not run for re-election. Hubert Humphrey was LBJ's vice president. He's going to run as Johnson's successor. He wants to basically continue what Johnson's doing in Vietnam. He's the one that's supported by the major Democrats. There was a strong challenge by Robert Kennedy, but he will be assassinated in California after he won the primary. So we have another Kennedy that was assassinated. In the Democratic Convention in Chicago, Humphrey had the votes, but there's a huge amount of peace activists there. They protest. Eventually, the Chicago Mayor Daley, who supported Humphrey, is going to have the police called, and they're going to start beating up peace activists. Like, one of the reasons is the peace activists wouldn't leave a public park. You weren't allowed to spend the night there. It became violent. There was some rocks thrown and stuff. But what you did was you turned on the TV for the Democratic National Convention, and you saw the police beating the heck out of peace activists, beating up other Democrats. And it made the Democrats look really, really bad. So even though Humphrey wins this, it looks like the Democrats are just falling apart between the Hawks and the Doves in their own party. This is Johnson by the end of his presidency. You could really just see what the Vietnam War has done to him. It's really just killed him. And he dies a couple years later. These are pictures from the Chicago riots in 1968 during the Chicago Convention. A lot of the violence was unjustified, but the peace activists were trying to provoke the cops. They were calling them names and saying stuff about their mothers, and I can't say the stuff here because of YouTube, but really, really bad stuff. And they did throw stuff sometimes, but the police went cray here. They didn't kill a lot of people. They used gas and stuff, and their hitter things that they hit the people with. But it became very violent. And here's the picture of Robert Kennedy's assassination. All right. The Republicans, however, are going to have a very smooth nomination process. They're going to nominate Richard Nixon, who, remember, lost in 1960, as a conservative moderate. There's going to be an extreme conservative party formed in 1968, run by George Wallace. George Wallace was the big segregationist who was from Alabama. He was the one that said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He forms the American Independent Party. They also wanted to nuke Vietnam. Nixon and Humphrey were very similar policies on Vietnam. There was no real choice between the two. In the election of 1968, Nixon will win by 0.5 percentage point without carrying a single major city, and the Democrats will still have a majority in Congress. Wallace will win 46 electoral votes in the Deep South. This is the largest third-party electoral vote in American history, and he was probably the worst third-party candidate in American history because he was hugely racist, kind of insane. And this right here shows the election of 1968. So going into next video, we have a new president, Richard Nixon, Republican. All right, kiddos, that's all I have for you for today. Until next time, deuces, deuces, yeah.